Good evening and welcome to today's seminar, Economic Development in Russia and Ukraine. My name is Martin Kragh, head of the Russia and Eurasia program here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Anders Åslund, standing to your right, is a well-known economist and specialist on the economic and political development in Eastern Europe. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., and the author most recently of the book Ukraine, What Went Wrong and How to Fix It. To your left is sitting Elsa Håstad, who is Assistant Director General at the Swedish Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA. She has several years of experience working with, among other things, development and social policy in the former Soviet Union. Anders will speak for about 25-30 minutes, followed by comments and discussions with Elsa, after which we will open the auditorium for questions and further discussion until we finish at 6 o'clock. Last but not least, the marketing department here at UI has asked me to remind you to make tweets from this seminar with the hashtag UI event. The information is here behind me. Thank you, and please commence, Anders.
Good evening, and it's a pleasure to see so many old friends here, many whom I haven't seen for a long time. And what I would like to try to give you today is a picture. Where are we in the economies of Russia and Ukraine? My bottom line, which I want to give you immediately, it is that the Russian economy is lousy, but it's more stable than people think. If it's unsustainable, it would rather be for social reasons, that there is no economic growth coming, not because of macroeconomic instability. With regard to Ukraine, that I've been very deeply involved in for the last 3 years, I'm quite optimistic. A lot has been accomplished. Last year, Ukraine did more reforms than it has done in any other year. So this was hopefully a breakthrough. But it's not yet clear. The big problem is the legal system, as in most of the region. I think that on Victory Day, the 9th of May, you got the best picture you could by watching Putin on Kremlin.ru. I love looking up on his videos because there you see the image that he really wants to show. So what was the Victory Day about this year? It was backward looking. All of a sudden, it was not the Soviet Union in the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, it was Russia. So it's about Russia, and the only foreign guest of rank was poor President Nazarbayev from Kazakhstan. So you get a feeling this is a backward looking, nostalgic Russia that doesn't have anything to say about the future, and least of all, of course, about Ukraine, because that's not so great. But let me look slightly back up on why is Putin so popular and how did it come about? If you look upon Putin's record from his first 9 years president or ruler, 7% a year growth. Can you do better than that? This is the best growth Russia ever had. But what role did Putin have in it? My argument is very strongly, as I've argued in my book, Russia's Capitalist Revolution, that he arrived at the late table. The fundamental reason for the growth was the market economic reforms of the 1990s. And in 98, the financial crisis cleaned out the problems in the economy. Enterprises that should long have gone bankrupt did go bankrupt, and Russian enterprises had to start paying one another that they hadn't done before. And then, of course, we had the rising oil prices. So Putin's period has very much been a credit and oil boom. There are many other countries. You can see many parallels with Brazil in it. And because of a big decline of officially more than 40% of GDP in the 1990s, there was massive spare capacity. So you say, how can you fail in such a situation? Of course you can fail. You can always fail. But it was not a marvel. And people find it difficult to distinguish cause and effect. They don't see that the cause is usually coming a long time before the effect. But now we are seeing quite a different picture. 7 years of essential stagnation, 1% a year growth. And what are the problems? Most of all, state and crony capitalism. The state sector has expanded steadily since the confiscation of Yukos oil company in 2003. The oil price has been lower for the last 2 years, and then financial sanctions hit in July 2014. So what you see is this picture, and it's going down. GDP down by 3.7% last year. If anything, the statistics are flattered in one way or the other. So this doesn't look so great. The sanctions are often questioned. I don't think that's correct. What is happening with the financial sanctions that were imposed in July 2014, that is that no money goes into Russia. All money goes out of Russia. And this is tapping $60 to $80 billion a year when Russia pays off its foreign debt as it's coming due. So this is quite a strain. And the assessments that the IMF has made on this suggest that this costs 1.5% of GDP approximately a year. And the remarkable thing here is how the Russian government has reacted to it. And this is the big message I have here today, that they have acted well with regard to macroeconomic adjustment, but they have not tried to get economic growth for dynamism. So thanks to a floating exchange rate that has fallen with the oil price, Russia has had imports falling more than exports. And this in turn has meant, it has meant that Russia has got a steady current account surplus. You can see here the red bars, that's exports, that used to be a bit more than $500 billion a year, and the imports used to be a bit more than $300 billion a year. Last year, imports fell by more than 1/3 in 1 year to less than $200 billion. So what Russia is doing, very intentionally, is squeezing the population, the standard of living, by making sure that the state has sufficient reserves. So you can say that 2/3 of the exports was oil and gas. If the oil price falls by half, that has happened approximately, when exports are down by 1/3. And at the same time, the imports altogether in these 2 years falling by about half. So this is a real squeeze, but it is being undertaken. So Russia undertook a quite extraordinary current account adjustment last year of 13% of GDP, which is big by any category. And this means that Russia's international currency reserves are not falling as I expected 1.5 years ago. On the contrary, they are staying high. They are staying at $385 billion, which is a lot. It's more than 1/3 of GDP. And why? Because Putin has decided so. Then the rest of the variables can be adjusted. And at the same time, the budget policy is very strict. You often hear reasoning about this, that Russia is running out of money. No. If Russia is finding that it has too little money, that is the Kremlin, then they cut the public expenditure. So what we're seeing is that the budget deficit is being kept now in the bad times at around 3% of GDP. And given that this is a real terms of trade shock, a serious, this is very conservative policy indeed. And you might notice that if you compare the budget deficit during these years, it's strikingly similar to Anders Borg's policy in Sweden, that having a budget surplus before the crisis, as we have learned one should have, and then go to a big deficit in 2009, and then you come back to balance. This is what Russia has done. And if we look up on the monetary policy, inflation is now down to 7% and it's likely to come down to 6%. And the central bank is simply defeating inflation with high interest rates. And this looks like this. Inflation has gone up because of devaluation and down because of very strict monetary policy. And similar with unemployment. You would expect if GDP falls by 3.7% in a year that you would get a lot of unemployment. But unemployment is kept at 6% or just below 6%. So to summarize this is stability in 5 important regards. Large international reserves, small budget deficit, a public debt of only 14% of GDP that most Western countries can only dream of, an exchange rate that falls flexibly with the oil price, leading to a large foreign surplus, low unemployment, and low inflation. So then you wonder, what has to give? And I've already given the answer. Standard of living. Real wages last year fell by 10%. Retail trade, which should fall about the same, indeed fell by 10% also. Investment by 8.4%. So you wonder then, why did GDP fall by only 3.7%? Well, mainly because of very positive net exports, but you can't eat net exports. They're not very tasty. So instead, this is hitting the population. And for those who are thinking about trade, why is exports to Russia falling so sharply? For one simple reason, the oil price, and the exchange rate falling with the oil price. Russia's GDP in dollar terms was 2 years ago 2.1 trillion. Today it's 1.2 trillion. It's been down to 1 trillion. It depends on if you have an exchange rate of 80 rubles per dollar or 65 rubles per dollar, as we have today. So these are straightforward antisocial policies. And I would argue that these are pretty much the same policies as Nicolae Ceausescu pursued in Romania in 1989, which were extremely fiscally conservative, paying off the foreign debt in a crisis situation. And that didn't work out very well in the end. So this is the question: is this socially sustainable? And we don't have a good answer to it. So what is the future outlook? The Russian economists now talk about this as the new normal. Growth is gone, but stability is there. They expect that the output decline will slow down. Real wages and standard of living will continue to fall more than output, but not as much as last year. Investment is reduced, also in state enterprises, which is a good thing, because that was the biggest waste or theft. But the interest in the cronies is preserved. So one of Putin's greatest friends, Arkady Rotenberg, was recently given Sheremetyevo Airport. So this is a state asset. Arkady Rotenberg is also has been given a non-competition contract to build the bridge over the Kerch Straits. And Rothenberg is generally very good at getting contracts for pipelines and roads. The problem is that it's not equally good at building the roads and pipelines, which means that the price tends to be 3 times higher than it should be in an open competition. And no reforms are in sight. There's been a bit of brouhaha about Alexei Kudrin, who's an excellent person, coming back as a deputy chairman in an economic council. Well, it's good to have a fig leaf to show up from time to time. It's good for Kudrin to show that he has contacts with Putin, and it's good to show Putin that he has some liberal tendencies. One should not take this seriously, because the state and crony system is so deeply ingrained. So then, what can give? The oil price is likely to stay where it is. Normally, we see that the oil prices move in long swings, a long decade up and a long decade stable or at a low level. And we are now in the beginning of a period of lower price since for 2 years. Clearly, Putin is not giving up on his friends. You know, you have to value your friends. So he's taking most care of them. And what could give is sanctions, because the important sanctions are connected with the Russian occupation of Donbass. And the Donbass war is not popular. It's costly. What Putin likes are small victorious wars, like Interior Minister Pleva stated in 1904, but the war against Japan did not turn out to be neither small nor victorious. The same can be said about Russia's war in eastern Ukraine. So I think that if the oil price falls low, then Russia could withdraw. This is where I can see a variable, not easily, but if you control all of the media anyhow, it's rather easy to get a face-saving device. You can just invent a face-saving device. It's much easier than in a democracy. The other 2 big alternatives I would exclude. But I would also add that from Putin's exercise in Syria, we can say that Putin is quite rational. I've written predictable here. I wouldn't say unpredictable, but rational, because we can't predict what he comes up with. But wasn't this clever? He spends about $500 million jumping into a vacuum. Before he went to Syria, he met Obama at the UN, and President Obama informed President Putin that he belonged to the 19th century, and enlightened Obama belongs to the 21st century. Therefore, Obama would not lift a finger if Russia started bombing in Syria. And Putin said, "Thank you for the information," and started bombing 3 days later. So this was a clear risk-evading effort. I don't quite understand why President Obama participated and provided this information. It has been much criticized for not providing a proper ambiguity in this case. And then after slightly less than half a year, President Putin says, "Now I'm withdrawing." And whether he does it or not, he says that I'm not committed. He has changed the facts on the ground and established himself in so many different ways. So this was quite a successful operation, and the experts assess that it only cost $500 million. And if you have $1 trillion in GDP, that's not too bad. So let me jump to something, the big picture of what has happened in the post-Soviet world. I see in this graph. So I'll explain it for you a bit. You see here 3 different groups of countries. On one axis, the vertical axis, I have Freedom House measurement of democracy. The higher you are, the freer you are. On the horizontal axis, I have Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. The further to the left you are, the more corrupt you are. And you are then seeing three clear groups. If a country is very corrupt, it is it for a purpose. It is because the rulers want to make a lot of money. They want to enrich themselves. And here we have, down to the left, Russia together with the Central Asians, Belarus and Azerbaijan. These are the countries where the rulers have got pretty full control. Kyrgyzstan is not true, but the others are true. And they can make sure that the profits or rents go to them. And I would say that in Russia, in the early 1990s when I worked there, corruption looked like this. There was a lot of corruption at the bottom of society, and there was little at the top. Now corruption in Russia looks like this. The poor civil servants are not allowed to take bribes any longer, but the people at the top get all the more. And this means that the economy functions better, the state functions better, but you get an enormously rich group of people on top who do not want to give up the power. So therefore, it makes sense that corruption and authoritarianism go very strictly together. And at the top, you have all the EU countries, all the 10 countries in the former Soviet bloc that have become members of the European Union. These countries have corruption under control. Why? Because the people control the government. They are full democracies. And people don't like corruption. Remember that Sweden was very corrupt until 1766, when we adopted the first Public Information Act in the world, which showed all the corrupt things that were going on. So Sweden was a very corrupt aristocracy until 1766, and then it was quickly improved. Denmark did the same thing 5 years later. This is what these countries really need to clean out. And then we have, and I should also say here, this shows that the European Union knows how to build democracy, and it knows how to build rule of law. This has very much been accomplished during the period up to EU membership. It's during the accession that the European Union can really pressure countries and say, you can't be this corrupt any longer. You have to have independent courts and professional prosecutors. The most interesting countries are the ones hanging in between. And this is essentially the Eastern Partnership: Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, and Georgia. Georgia is the only post-Soviet country that has managed to defeat corruption on its own as much as the others. This was done through President Saakashvili's clean out of the court and prosecutors, sack them all. The same was, by the way, done in Estonia and in East Germany. So this is what has proven successful. Ukraine is quite unique here. You can see it's sort of in the middle of everything. It is as corrupt as the post-Soviet countries in general, but it is a very free country. No country is as corrupt as Ukraine and so transparent. So this means that you would expect Ukraine to move to one of these two equilibria, the good or the bad equilibria. And this is why I think that we in the West should generally focus on getting Ukraine right, because that's where we can make the difference. Down in that corner, we can't do anything until something really breaks. And up in the right corner, we've already done the job. That is not the priority right now. So My message here is that this is not the man who will save Russia. This is something completely different. This I picked from his website. He loves putting himself in uniforms like this. So it's really quite a treasure. Brzezinski says that this shows that Putin is no Hitler, he's only a Mussolini. Mussolini loved dressing up just like Putin. Oop. Sorry, I thought I had another PowerPoint here. No? Ukraine. The Ukrainian one. This is the old. Nej, det blev fel. Ursäkta, men då tar jag det. Låt mig hålla den bilden då bara, så tar jag det i ord om Ukraina. Jag hade ändrat.
Anders, it's in English.
Oh, sorry.
And we have only about 5 minutes if we're going to keep the schedule, so it could be a good thing that the PowerPoint disappeared.
Very good. So, what I would like to say about Ukraine. First, there are great achievements that have been done in the last year. To begin with, Ukraine last year cut public expenditure from 53% of GDP to 44% of GDP, by 9% of GDP in 1 year. This is what the Baltic countries did in 2009. And generally it was said, normal countries, big countries, etc. can't do it. Ukraine proved that it could do so. And this in a politically fluid situation. And how was this done? Most of all through unification of energy prices. But the way of making big money in Ukraine has been to have good relations with Gazprom and good relations with the president, preferably buying the president from money you get from Gazprom. And you get the money by buying gas at a very low price and selling it at several times higher price. This has also been done domestically. So until 2 years ago, the gas price in Ukraine was 12% of the market price. And there you had a few well-selected oligarchs who bought the gas at that price, and then they sold it at the market price and made billions of dollars and perhaps shared it with the president. So in order to avoid that, you need to unify the prices. Poland, for example, did this in 1992. Therefore, we did not have this kind of corruption. And this took away probably 7% of GDP in public subsidies last year. At the same time, Ukraine cut its imports of oil and gas by 3/4, partly because of lower world prices, partly because of a much less consumption. Ukrainian banking functioned like this under Yanukovych. You know, the best way of robbing a bank is to own a bank. Because an owner of a bank only owns 8% of the assets. So what the Yanukovych clients normally did was that they took over a bank. You know, you do not necessarily have to pay for a bank in Ukraine, but you take it over. And then they gave 80% of the loans to themselves. And if you're a big businessman in Ukraine, you don't need to pay. So they simply took 10 times the money. And now Ukraine has an extraordinarily tough lady, Valeria Hontaryeva, as chairwoman of the National Bank. So she has closed, in 1.5 years, 68 banks, taken on the whole lot of these rowdy big businessmen. And taking out more than 1/3 of the banks. And something that has turned out to work very well is increased transparency. Ukraine has established registers, as we have here in Sweden, of all kinds of property. That works. And in particular, they have now revealed the owners of all banks. And in the end, there were 5 banks whose owners refused to reveal themselves. So the central bank just had to close them. But it works. And there has been also substantial deregulation. There's been a lot of electronic state procurement, which has cleaned up a lot. And of course, IMF financing and debt restructuring. So what has been done is that the current account deficit has been eliminated, which was 9% of GDP in 2013, thanks to floating exchange rate. The budget deficit has gone from 10 to 2% of GDP. And international reserves, thanks mainly to IMF loans, have increased from $5 billion to $13 billion in a year. And therefore, the exchange rate has stabilized. The inflation has in 1 year gone down from 61%, which is a bit on the high side, to currently 10%. And then you will soon get credit going again. So financial stability has essentially been accomplished. So then you wonder what has not been done. Reform of the prosecution and courts. This is the big issue. And this is what all the Western donors are now banging about. President Poroshenko obviously wants to continue control the judicial system because it's good to have. It gives you a lot of power. And if you're president, you tend to want to have a lot of power. And to fight corruption is clearly not the main priority there. So what are the main reforms that should be done now? First of all, judicial reform, prosecution. And without that, you don't have real property rights. Second, to complete the energy reform that has already gone far, to create real energy markets. And that is quite close. Something that wasn't done at all last year is privatization. Ukraine has 3,500 state enterprises for no good reasons. And half of these are actually standing still. The best 100 are generating incomes to well-connected people normally sitting in the parliament. This is not no good. And then you need the hard, heavy reforms. Civil service reform has been legislated, is now supposed to be implemented, and more deregulation is needed. On the social side, I would put school reform first. Will this happen? Well, I think that a lot of reforms are so much in the pipeline, so that they are likely to happen. But the fundamental thing in a reform, that is that the leader actually wants to reform. And the big question mark is about prosecution and court. So on this cautiously optimistic note, I think I'll leave you there for the time being. Thank you.
We will now go over to the questions and answers with Elsa and Anders. You also provided us with a few slides, yes. Or is it just one, perhaps?
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Anders. And I actually have 5 comments building on your presentation. And my 5 comments lead up to 5 questions. Let me start where you ended with Ukraine. And good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's very nice to be here. And 200 of you got an invitation saying that Disa Håstad would be standing here talking to Anders Åslund. But she's also here as a special surprise, but it was actually me, so it's 2 of us today. You can talk to her also after. Let me start with Ukraine, and I have 2 reforms that I would like to talk about, and then I have a question. And as you say, more reforms has been done 2015 in Ukraine, perhaps than ever before. And one of the biggest is the decentralization reform. So let me start with that one, because it's a large-scale reform of decentralization in Ukraine. The main idea is, of course, to provide a true local governance through amalgamation. So we have 12,000 communities, and they are about to amalgamate into 1,500. This could be compared with the Swedish similar reform in 71, where we moved from 2,000 to 290 communes. So the idea is, of course, local democracy, but it's also to create service centers for citizens, so-called one-stop shop, where the citizens can get their help with everything from land certificates, social service, ID cards, schooling issues. And why is this so important? Well, firstly, this is part of the EU integration process. This is also a way to reduce corruption, because as many of you know, the more you meet with a civil servant, the more possibilities you have to corrupt or to give money. So one-stop shop is a way to reduce corruption. This is also a way to build trust between citizens and local authorities. There are incentives, financial incentives. If you merge, you get more money from the central budget. And there's a strong commitment from everyone. Sweden, EU, Germany, US, many others are heavily engaged in this multi-year reform. And of course, the main committer is Ukraine, the government. So the challenges, and here is where I need your help, Anders. 3, challenge number 1, the process is actually voluntary, the process of amalgamation. This is a huge challenge. Because in 71 in Sweden it was compulsory, still quite painful. But here it's a voluntary process. Challenge number 2, this requires a major shift of power from many mayors, many local decision makers, to fewer mayors, to fewer local decision makers. We have tried, and challenge number 3, we have tried before. We, meaning Sweden, meaning Ukraine, and it didn't work. The truth is that Sweden, we've been engaged before in decentralization reform. Some of you sitting here today might know this. It did not take off as planned. Why? Weak political commitment. However, happily for you, being Swedish taxpayers, some of the work done then can be reused. But still, Ukraine have tried before. So, good news, we have a new prime minister in Ukraine, Mr. Volodymyr Groysman, as you all know, and he has a closer and better cooperation with the President Poroshenko, so the reform might actually take place. But still, as an economist, Anders, what would you say to the mayors when we try to create incentives and to make this happen? We do not want to see another failure. So that is my first comment and my first question. And we have them all written down, so we will remember together. The second comment is about energy reform in the energy sector. And you talk a lot about this, Anders. And as you point out, major reforms have taken place. And we know that the cutting of the subsidies have actually created results. Energy consumption in Ukraine have decreased with almost 1/3 in industries, households and public utilities. And we also know that that means less corruption. As you say yourself, the subsidies were really creating corruption or possibilities for corruption. They made the rich richer. The Ukrainian gas dependency is equally distributed between Russia and EU. It's also good, could be even better, of course. And but when I read your excellent brief from April 2016 on securing Ukraine's energy sector, you talk a lot about Ukraine's own large energy resources and that it's poorly managed, highly corrupt. And you have a lot of priorities that could be done. I will not list all of them because you can read the brief yourself. It's really good. But you talk about, just to give you a flavor, stop buying gas from Russia, support Ukraine in international governance institution, real market for gas and electricity should be allowed to develop, and many other important issues. But I don't really find you to be a believer in renewable energy. How come? Am I wrong? As you know, Sweden, together with EBRD, is investing in renewable facilities, and we also try to attract private sector in this. And I am convinced that the shift has to take place because Ukraine wants to be a modern country moving on the road to EU integration, and we all know that association agreement talk a lot about green economy, sustainable energy. Ukraine has committed to the new global goals, including goal 13. Everyone here knows, of course, it is about fighting climate change. So it's actually no turning back for Ukraine. And the wind is blowing in Ukraine and they have forests. So are you a believer or not, Anders? And now I'm moving on to Russia. So that's Ukraine, and then 3 comments about Russia. A little bit on self-criticism. Many of you sitting here today, you were also present when it all happened, when the Soviet Union fell. So was I. I grew up in the Soviet Union, and then I spent parts of my youth standing in long queues, waiting to buy some butter or milk or whatever I needed. As you know, when the Soviet Union fell, Sweden was deeply involved. We were deeply engaged in supporting the reforms in Russia. And we had such high expectations. We had enormous expectation on the transition from communism to democracy, from planned economy to market economy. And we were engaged in energy policy, social security, environment. And we also had a huge group of advisors, development partners. I was one of them. Advisors, that was you, Anders, and investors. Perhaps some of you are here. But I hear people say that we did not enough. The advices were bad and we could have done more. I don't know if I agree with that, but still I would like to share this concern with you, Anders. Did you give good advices, or could you have given other advices? Is this a moment of self-criticism? Okay, moving on. Market economy. Is Russia still a market economy? We know that Russia needs to improve rule of law. You said it yourself. We know Russia needs to reduce corruption in order to attract foreign direct investment. We know that there are some sensitive things today in Russia, some topics you don't talk about, and that is the governmental ownership. You, of course, Anders, bravely talked about that just here. But we know it has increased and it is very non-transparent who owns what. Although you revealed a secret about Sheremetyevo. We also know that the cost of militarization is very non-transparent. We also know that there are 60,000 entrepreneurs in prison today in Russia. 60,000. And then you said 200,000 in pre-trial, so even more. We know that poverty has increased, approximately 4 million people, just as a result of the last years of recession. This is from a World Bank report that just came out. The same report states that 14.3% of the population is poor in monetary terms. However, good news, pointed out by you also, Anders, there are skill experts, very good technocrats in Russia, working in financial state sector. The budget is almost balanced. We also know that you wrote a book in 1995, How Russia Became a Market Economy. So my question to you, of course, is can we still call Russia a market economy, given the lack of new entrepreneurs rising, given the lack of security for entrepreneurs, given the very strong ownership? And finally, the future. You did give us some answers, but I have 3 scenarios that I would like to elaborate a little bit on. And so this is the future. Scenario number 1, more conflicts. Why? Well, the social contract has to be rewritten. All of you following Russia, you know that the good years with Russia, with Putin, the social contract between Putin and the Russian population was about Putin delivering stability and economic growth and loyalty from the people. Now, the same cannot be delivered, as you know. So what happens? Well, Putin is showing military strength in Syria, cleverly, as you said, Anders, and by very aggressive behavior, like, for example, Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So the contract has to be rewritten from stability to power. So this drives conflicts. So is this what we can expect, a more conflict scenario? Second scenario, a more positive one, but not totally unrealistic, and that is a re-engaging with the West scenario. Russia fulfills the Minsk agreement, contributes to a peaceful solution in Ukraine, removal of sanctions will follow, reforming justice sector, improving rule of law, encouraging investors and a new generation of entrepreneurs, and they do not have to go to prison. And this is quite optimistic, but it's not unrealistic. And then the third one, Maidan 2 scenario. Anders, you just showed this photo with Putin. This man cannot save Russia. So my third and final scenario would be that no, Putin is not the savior, and what happens, people are fed up with economic decline, income loss of 9.5%, decline in living standards, people are getting poorer. We know already that consumption is decreasing. People in Russia simply eat and consume less. So they are fed up. Once again, fed up and mobilize themselves, as we could see in 2011. And they go out into the streets, and what happens, we do not know. But that is perhaps the third scenario. Thank you.
Thank you, Elsa. And please...
Yes, please let me respond immediately. I think these were all excellent points and questions. I'll take them in order. With regard to decentralization, use the power of a state. The Ukrainians are used that everything comes from the top. And as you pointed out, the system is impossible. The lowest entities are too small to have a normal administration. They are not used to have any independence of financing at all. So therefore, they will only be grateful if they get something. So push it down the throat on them, and they will accept it, and then you will get entities exactly as in Sweden. So, but they are, you can use the central power much better. On energy reform, I don't mention renewable energies, but it's not central. Because Ukraine last year saved 20% energy. This year it's likely to save 20% again. So these are the big gains. It's getting the elementary market functioning, and renewable comes lower down. And of course, wind energy is developed. Solar energy, it was one of Yanukovych's oligarchs, Andrei Kragh, who tried to develop it, and with massive subsidies, they are out now because it was not profitable, and I'm afraid that is in bankruptcy, so that was not the ideal. Well, wind power is actually quite commercially viable. With regard to Russia, Ukraine has stopped buying gas from Russia. And the problem is not that it's Russian gas, the problem is how it's sold. Russia insists on charging officially a high price and then giving discretionary discounts by the government from day to day. You can't have such a kind of deals. Russia needs to move to normal market-based trade in gas. We have no problems with oil trade between Russia and Ukraine. You never hear about it because it's normal and market-based. Gas trade is used as a geopolitical weapon and as a weapon of corruption. As long as Gazprom insists on doing that, it should not be treated as a normal enterprise. Gazprom is a company where Putin and company pick up about $25 billion in a good year in overpriced state procurement and asset stripping. So Yuri Kovalchuk and Bank Eurasia has taken over all Gazprom's financial assets, Gazprom Bank and the insurance company Sugas, etc. and all the media assets at very low prices. So if Gazprom were treated like a normal company, no Swedish bank would allow to open a bank account, because this is an organized crime syndicate by any ordinary definition. So this, and Ukraine is very much weaker. Can take the example, it was Reuters who wrote a wonderful article about Dmitry Firtash about a year ago, the Yanukovych gas trader. Firtash got to begin with credit line by Gazprom Bank of $11 billion. For this, he could buy gas cheaply from Gazprom and sell it at a normal price in Ukraine. And it's perceived, we don't know this, that Firtash contributed about $500 million to each of Yanukovych's election campaigns in 2010 and 2012. And now Forbes assesses that Firtash has last year only $500 million, now less. So Firtash was essentially just a Russian gas agent. He was not a real businessman at all. And this is how Gazprom operates. And of course, the Kremlin. The third point, self-criticism. What went wrong in Russia? I would say that there was a very brief window of opportunity. When we came to Moscow in November '91 to advise the Russian government, it was a mess. We all knew that it was a mess. And what Jeffrey Sachs particularly pushed, which I completely agreed with, was that the West needed to put up a fair amount of money quickly to give credibility to the reforms and the reformers. The amount then discussed was $25 billion. After Afghanistan and Iraq, this seems like tiny money, but the only people who really could think and discuss it was the United States. And Bush, the elder, thought that this was unpopular. And that he shouldn't do it. And he was also so satisfied that he had just done German reunification. So he was already hero in his own history book. So to do something with Russia was too much. And on top of it, they thought that Gorbachev was much better than Yeltsin, so why should they support Yeltsin? And on details here, well, we have Örjan Berner here and Misha Solman. We were all discussing this very intensely at the time, and there were a number of things that had to be done that we all saw. First, to get control over the central bank. The reformers never got control over the central bank. It was this nice professorial type, Matyukhin, who thought that one should have a moderate money expansion of 10% a month. Then you get at least that much inflation. And that this nice chap did not understand. The second thing was to deregulate energy prices. This was, Yegor Gaidar pushed very hard with Yeltsin, and Yeltsin almost agreed to it, but then in the end it didn't happen. On the 1st of January, this I think Yegor considered his main failure, where he had been close to it, but not quite achieved it. And this meant that you could buy 1 ton of oil in Russia for $1 and sell it abroad for $100. This is how all the oligarchs made their early money. It was not through privatization, but through commodity trade with regulated prices and export control. And then a third thing was Russia had a ruble zone together with 14 other countries in the former Soviet Union. So what started immediately after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was competitive emission between 15 countries to issue ruble credits to get as large a share of a common GDP as possible. The winner in this competition was Ukraine, which got hyperinflation of 10,000% in 93, but a larger share of GDP in 92. So this had to be broken up, and Gaidar pushed it, but did not quite know how to do it. Most of the others didn't understand. They didn't know that credit was money. They thought that only cash is money. And that's where it broke. And then politically, Russia needed early parliamentary elections. But this is Yeltsin himself, who thought that we have two big tasks that we must handle first in this catastrophe. One is to get a peaceful break-up of the Soviet Union, which he handled masterly in December 91, and the other to do economic reforms, which turned out to be not possible to do with decree. So the point is that in order to do good reforms, you have to have a parliament, and that is decent and responsible to the population, and that was not the case. Is Russia a market economy? I can only agree with your points here. The state sector is too big today. The market is too unfree, and property rights are too undermined. So it's with a big question mark. This has been a big step backwards, and it's a question where exactly one draws the line. On your scenarios, I would discard the re-engaging with the West when it comes to domestic issues. Foreign policy, okay. There one can do various things, but not when it comes to real reforms inside Russia. So I see two essentially scenarios. One is decline and more repression in order to make the decline acceptable to the population, so to say, the Stalin scenario, even if one doesn't need to take it that far. I see my Russian friends, what they do now, very many leave the country who can. Others go into internal immigration, deal with arts and such things. It's very reminiscent of the 1980s. People do not want to cross into being full opposition to a considerable extent. And the people are worrying about when the borders will close. People are discussing, are we 1932 or 1933? When will Kirov's murder take place? Who is Kirov today? And you see these discussions all the time. And the other scenario that I see is pretty much what you pointed as Maidan 2, social unrest, but I think it would lead to a coup at the top. And I think that we would see then the Putin system implode, because it's really a personalized, deinstitutionalized system. So I think we would be back to August 91, but we would be in August 91 without the Yeltsin with a democratic mandate. On the other hand, much more, we would have some kind of market economy and much more educated cadres. So I think that the result would be better.
Okay, thank you. We have about 15 minutes for questions and discussions. Do I see any hands? Yes, we have a question here, second row.
My name is Kjell Lundqvist from the International Rouge Movement. I must say this is a sad evening. You are totally out of reality. How can you even discuss Ukraine without mentioning Stefan Bandera? That is very, very strange. The ones who don't know who Stefan Bandera is the great, nowadays historical hero in Ukraine. And he was a collaborator with
yes, sir.
Hitler.
Yeah, we understand. So you're critical of the current government in Ukraine.
No, I'm
and the
critical
political
about
system. Yeah.
what the UEI is doing with inviting and spreading just some very strange ideas about our eastern neighbors. That is both Russia. It's a discussion here. And you said, asked about the Minsk agreement, for example. As you must know, the Ukraine government had done nothing to implement their part of the Minsk agreement. And why don't you mention that?
All right.
Can I?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, of course, Minsk agreement is not about the economy, and that was what I was discussing. But I should mention here that GDP decline in Ukraine is entirely caused by the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So we have here steadily had something between 7,000 and 12,000 Russian troops in occupied Donbass, and that should not be there according to the Minsk agreement. Also, the OSCE should have full access to the occupied territory. It has access to about 1/3 of the territory. And Ukraine should be given control over the border. It has no control over the border. We saw now on Victory Day that DNR in Donetsk had a military march with lots of equipment that is not allowed according to the Minsk agreement. I can go on.
Okay, thank you. Misha, yes.
Thank you, Anders, for this presentation. I have a question around the influence of the West in Kiev and Ukraine. As it is, the Ukraine is very dependent on finance from IMF and others, and cooperation, which Elsa has been talking about. Nonetheless, we have seen the political system dragging its feet. You have explained the successes, but you have also pointed to important aspects of the reform process which is not happening. And we have seen this change of prime minister. But what leverage has the West on what happens really in the Rada and in the government?
The answer is that the West has enormous influence in Ukraine, and it gets a lot done, but not everything. So who are the West? The IMF is enormously effective. It focuses on a few things, a few conditions, and those conditions have to be fulfilled. And it sticks to its mandate. So it does not go far into structural issues, while it has gone further into it than the IMF normally does. So in this case, the IMF demands 20 laws before they're given to be adopted that are essential of structural nature before they give the next tranche. So the IMF comes first. Second comes the US, where Vice President Joe Biden has been calling President Poroshenko about every 10th day on average. So this is a far greater interference than we have ever seen before at a very high level. And the US is then mainly discussing these complicated political issues like sacking the prosecutor general with limited success. So here we see, with regard to the law enforcement system, that's where we have the biggest resistance. The EU, I would argue, so far has been quite ineffective. And it is because Brussels does not have much policy. It appears that Germany as such is more effective, and perhaps even Sweden. So the EU is sort of an absent landlord. If you talk to the EU ambassador in Kiev, he says, I don't have instructions. I can't do this without authorization. He's sensible, but the EU is not up to the game as it has been in other cases. But what happens to prosecution and then to the courts, I see, is the real litmus test of the relationship between Ukraine and the West. And the point is, of course, that Ukraine has so small reserves. It needs the Western financing so badly. And when it doesn't need it any longer, then I would expect that the listening to the West will be much less, as we have seen repeatedly before.
Okay, good. We have a question here from Susanna Oxenstierna.
Yes, I'm Susanna Oxenstierna from FOI. Thank you very much for two very interesting presentations. And I was wondering, you don't talk so much about institutions, and when we look at the sort of result of the reform efforts of the 90s and 2000s in these countries, both Eastern European and post-Soviet countries, but it's evident that in some countries it didn't work. And I liked your picture, Anders, that you had from Freedom House, because it really shows this. And but on the other hand, it also says that yes, okay, a country with a command economy that is socialist and has had this system for a while, they can do economic reforms, and then it will be sustainable if they are integrated into a democratic structure that has very strong institutions. But otherwise, it doesn't work so well. I mean, it didn't work. It hasn't worked, at least for these Soviet countries that you had in the other corner. But what says that Ukraine, Georgia, etc., how can these reforms become sustainable, and how do you build strong institutions when you don't have the possibility of integrating them in the way the other countries were? Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. I would focus on the parliamentary system. First, you need a parliamentary system. It's typical that all the authoritarian states, apart from Kyrgyzstan, which is not really authoritarian, has presidential systems. The in-between states have parliamentary presidential systems. The democratic states have essentially parliamentary systems. A parliamentary system means that you have much more transparency. You have more checks and balances. In a presidential system, you can see that virtually all the presidents sit in the old central committee buildings, and they use the same methods in the same rooms. They call people and say what should be done. It's not done by paper. It's not done by a procedure, but by phone. Then proportional elections, and essentially to take money out of the politics. So what has been happening in Ukraine is that a normal election has cost $1 to $2 billion. Recently, they have run out of money, so it's perhaps only $250 million or so. But Ukrainian elections are very expensive. It's the same, for example, in India and in Brazil and in Mexico. So this is nothing untypical. This is more countries at that level and that degree of democratization. So how do you take the money out? Well, say the election in Ukraine cost $1 billion. In Sweden, it cost $12 million. Public financing, which has been legislated. And that should do a lot if it can be imposed. And all the EU members have managed to impose that quite effectively. So that's not utopian. Then a proportional list with open lists, the system that Germany and Finland have to elect members of the parliament. So you can't buy a place on the list, as has been commonplace in Ukraine for up to $10 million, a safe place on a party list. So these are important ways of getting money out of the politics, because as long as you have lots of money, then you have a few oligarchs controlling the politics.
would you like to add?
Yes, I would just like to add that the EU process, we have seen that the EU accession process is extremely strengthening for the institutions. And the countries that you had there up in the right corner, they were EU member countries, and then the middle group are Eastern Partnership countries. And the process in itself is a driving force to actually strengthen your institutions.
Okay, we have time for only one more question. I apologize to other people who wanted to also raise questions, but Ingmar, please be brief.
Thank you, Anders, for an excellent lecture. You and Elsa talked about energy and renewable sources, but you didn't mention nuclear power.
Closer to the microphone, Ingmar.
You didn't mention nuclear power. Could you say something about that, its role in the Ukrainian economy and perhaps also in the Russian one?
Nuclear power is very important in the Ukrainian economy. It's 55% of the electricity is generated from nuclear, and this has been given a big priority. Ukraine has traditionally had only Russian technology and everything from Russia. Now they are instead buying from Westinghouse and also American company Holtec. Westinghouse, which is to us Swedes better known as Asea-Atom. It produces now the nuclear fuel rods in a place called Västerås. So Sweden plays a major role in this, while since it's Westinghouse, you normally don't see the labels of it. For Russia, Rosatom is the old ministry. It's a typical example of what a company should not look like. And Rosatom has been tried to sell nuclear power stations in many places in the world, for example, Hungary and Turkey. But this has been done with Bank credits. And the Bank is now in effect in a state of restructuring. So I think that Rosatom will lose all these credits. So in Turkey, I think they have already sold their part. In Hungary, I don't think that the nuclear power station will be built as planned because the credits won't be there. So Rosatom is one of the interesting dramas to look upon, and this is of course good that they are tightening the purse strings on something like that. Okay.
We will thank you with a round of applause again, and thank you for coming. Before you leave, I would just also like to remind you, if you didn't see it, tomorrow morning we will be hosting Mustafa Dzhemilev, who's a famous Soviet dissident, human rights activist, and the leaders of Crimean Tatars. He will be here at 9 in the morning. Thank you.